Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. Today I've decided to do a video on 50 traits of givers versus takers. Now, in this context, when I talk about givers and takers, I talk about givers being empaths and takers being narcissists, because this is usually the case. This is a very magnetic dynamic. Takers, so narcissists, are attracted to empaths, because a taker cannot take unless there is somebody willing to give. So that's why it is really important to talk about this today. Now, I'm going to start with the first trait of an empath or giver. And after that, I'm going to talk about the first trait of a taker or a narcissist. So, number one, an empath or a giver takes care of self and others, whereas a narcissist or a taker takes care of themselves. A giver loves unconditionally, whereas a taker loves conditionally. Number three, a giver thinks, why shouldn't I help? Whereas a taker thinks, why should I help? Number four, a giver usually releases, whereas a taker usually controls. Number five, an empath or a giver usually has a high capacity for pain, whereas a narcissist or a taker usually has a low capacity for pain. Number six, a giver asks, how will this benefit others? Whereas a taker asks, what's in it for me? A giver finds strength and peace in spiritual wisdom, whereas a taker finds strength and peace in externals and things. A giver or empath is a sharer, whereas a narcissist or a taker is a collector. A giver is dependable, whereas a taker is dependent. A giver gives unlimited love and attention, whereas a narcissist or a taker takes unlimited attention and support. A giver is flexible, open to sudden changes, whereas a taker is usually too busy or too inflexible to meet other people's needs. A giver has no expectation of a return, whereas a taker usually expects a return. A giver is committed to others, whereas a taker is committed to themselves. A giver supports others, whereas a taker undermines others. A giver energizes others, whereas a taker depletes others' energy. A giver or empath is constructively critical, whereas a narcissist or taker is judgmentally critical. A giver is trusting and is able to give others the benefit of a doubt, whereas a taker is usually distrusting or suspicious of others. A giver usually clearly announces their agenda, whereas a taker has a cleverly hidden agenda most of the time. A giver is concerned with the essential and the important, whereas a taker is usually controlling and perfectionistic. A giver is usually a listener, and a taker is usually a needy talker. A giver or empath is defensive and supporting, whereas a narcissist or a taker is offensive and usually attacking. A giver can face and work through pain, whereas a taker has a fear of pain and suffering. A giver forgives, forgets, and comes back more supportive, whereas a taker doesn't forgive unless they have to or it benefits them. A giver willingly gives up their own agenda for others, whereas a taker will stop at nothing to get their way. A giver is a doer, whereas a taker or a narcissist is a whiner. A giver is proactive, whereas a taker is reactive. A giver or empath is willing to take out trash and do dirty work, whereas a narcissist or a taker refuses to submit to demeaning tasks below their dignity. A giver is patient, whereas a taker is impatient. A giver helps facilitate healing, whereas a taker or narcissist causes pain. A giver sheds tears and feels deep grief when they are hurt. A taker usually doesn't talk, trust, or feel emotions deeply. A giver accepts responsibility for their actions. A taker mercilessly projects responsibility and blame onto others. A giver doesn't particularly enjoy attention, whereas a taker draws attention to themselves by maybe flaunting their expensive cars or expensive jewelry, their successes, etc. A giver is generous, a taker is stingy. A giver maintains appropriate communication, whereas a taker is usually quite a gossip and is very untrustworthy. A giver says, "I will be there for you if you need me." A taker says, "See ya, bye," so they don't care. A giver's relationship is usually unconditional, whereas a taker's relationship is conditional. A giver has no need for secrets, whereas a taker is secretive. A giver is usually open and honest, whereas a taker unfortunately lies very often. A giver lives in a reality-based world, whereas a taker lives in a fantasy-based world. A giver or empath says that things just aren't that important to them, whereas a taker is very materialistic. An empath or a giver is a survivor, whereas a narcissist or taker is a victim. An empath or giver gives people gifts freely, whereas when a narcissist or a taker gives gifts, these gifts usually have strings attached. A giver or empath is always growing and developing as a person, whereas a narcissist or taker is usually stuck in the same place. An empath's words and promises have meaning, whereas a narcissist's words or promises cannot be trusted. An empath or giver is usually mature, whereas a narcissist or taker is usually immature. A giver or empath is usually selfless, whereas a taker or narcissist is usually selfish. A giver or empath has realistic expectations of others, whereas a narcissist or taker has unrealistic expectations of others. A giver or empath is approachable, whereas a narcissist or taker is usually unapproachable. And lastly, a giver or empath is sensitive and genuinely empathetic to other people's pain, whereas a narcissist or taker is insensitive to other people's pain or needs. That is the full list of 50 traits of an empath versus a narcissist, a giver versus a taker. Now, like I said at the beginning, an empath is a narcissist's fuel. The narcissist takes from the empath. So if you are in a relationship with a narcissist and you are the one that is depleted from constantly giving, then it's about time that you stop giving and you get out of this relationship, because it is not healthy for you and you are being harmed constantly. So these are the two lists of empaths versus narcissists, of givers versus takers. I hope you found this useful. I know I did when I first started thinking about it and researching it. So just remember that without an empath, a narcissist cannot gratify their need for this supply. That's the end of the video, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a good week. And if there is any other topic you would like me to do a video on, then please leave any suggestions in the comments below, and I will do my best to create a video that is helpful to you and that may answer some of your questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great week wherever you are, and take care of yourselves. Bye.